on particular cases. We also work on particular cases. Omavi Shakur joined us this semester from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is our practitioner in residence at the Initiative for a Just Society here at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. And Omavi has been an extraordinary colleague and thinker and has done just remarkable work putting together and conceptualizing this abolition practicum. Omavi has a background in criminal defense work and civil rights representation. He began as a well, actually, he graduated from Columbia College a few years ago, and then after attending law school, he went down to New Orleans to be a public defender down in New Orleans, which is a really in the trenches defense work, heavy caseload. And after that, he set up a law center in Little Rock, Arkansas. He also went to Chicago to work on mostly police shooting cases, civil rights litigation involving police shooting cases. Then he moved to New York to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and now he's with us as our practitioner in residence on this new project, which is the Initiative for a Just Society. So in this practicum, we've covered a lot of ground, from settler colonialism to capture and kidnapping and bringing us to the present. And in today's session, we were going to be focusing on, and will be focusing on, what we call displacement and exclusion, looking particularly at the Haitian crisis right now. And so we have the readings. I'm going to pass it over to Omavi to kick us off, but I just wanted to kind of connect this to the strike movement and to the economic questions that are so kind of in front of us with the strike and the negotiations, to this passage in the first readings from Tendai Achiume. It's on page 4 of our reader, where she is talking about what so-called economic migrants, because the term, and we'll talk about this, but the term itself of economic migrants is a loaded concept. And she writes, when we see so-called economic migrants, this is kind of 2/3 down the page, traveling from parts of the world that are economically decimated, that should be seen, she says, that should be seen as decolonial in the sense that it's an individual attempt to assert a greater capacity to self-determine in structural conditions of subordination. We should be seeing the movement of economic migrants as decolonial and worthy of protection. And of course, that's what she argues in her book, Migration as Decolonization. I thought that that's, of course, an immediate segue to what we're going to be talking about today, which is about migration and from Haiti and all of the issues around that. And so I'm hoping that we'll have a really good opportunity to wed our conversation about displacement and exclusion to issues of political economy that are so important for the negotiations today in the strike. So without anything more, let me pass it to Omavi to both introduce our guest speaker and also to kind of frame and moderate the conversation. And thank you all. And thanks, Omavi.
Thank you, Bernard. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So thank you all for coming to attend this section. It's very important to us, to the material that we're covering in the Abolition Practicum. Here we are today, at the outset of designing this course, we wanted to make sure that we talked about and explored the ways that U.S. Imperialism not only excludes people from their homelands, be it various means covered in the readings and that Gabrielle will talk about, but in addition to displacing people, actually excludes people from its borders as well, and how this ties in to the need for abolition of not just prisons, police, and surveillance, but in U.S. imperialism and hegemony as well. And so for today, we wanted to make sure, we very much believe that we can cover sort of big issues like this through entry points specific to localized harmed people. And so we're going to be covering sort of this big area of interest of ours through the lens of the struggle of Haitian migrants and the struggle in a lot of ways of the country of Haiti, period, since its inception. Not just the struggles, but some of the triumphs, which I'm glad that we have covered here as well. And so for today, we have an amazing set of readings that I would love to take credit for putting together, but actually were put together by Gabrielle Apollon. I've known Gabrielle for over 15 years. She's one of the most brilliant, kind, and empathetic people I know. We are all better people for even just being on a Zoom with her. And I'm not being hyperbolic in saying that. She's currently the co-director at NYU's Haiti Justice and International Accountability Project. And as if that were not enough right now, she's also a supervising attorney at NYU's Torture, Rendition, and Detention Project. But even prior to her great work at NYU, she was engaged in direct representation. She represented various young people in immigration and family law matters here in the city. And prior to law school, Gabrielle worked at the United Nations Office of the Special Envoy to Haiti as a research specialist. So she's brilliant. She's experienced not only sort of on the theoretical level, but also in the direct services side. She's an NYU law grad. She graduated from Columbia in undergrad. And we were actually at Columbia together. So I think we might remember some of those strikes in the mid 2000s or the mid aughts. But beyond her academic and professional ties to advocating on behalf of Haitians and migrants, the struggle for obtaining dignity for people fleeing neocolonial harms is personal for Gabrielle, as she comes from a Haitian family that has its own migration story. So I'm going to shut up and turn on a light so I don't look like the Dark Knight and turn it over to Gabrielle. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Omavi, and thank you to all of you for being here and opening up this space for us to have this conversation, because I recognize that this space is supposed to function in a lot of different ways and help move the organizing forward. So I echo others' hopes that this will actually intersect and hopefully we'll see this as relevant to the struggles that you all are engaging in as well. But I do want to say, I wish that I could take a class with Omavi, having known him for this long, and so I'm jealous of all of you. And Omavi already mentioned, but it's nice to be in a Columbia space. I did Columbia undergrad and also SEPA before going to law school. I live in Harlem, so not too far from Columbia at this time. But I was thinking today I'll share a little bit more just about the work that I do, a bit more kind of delving into the readings, and then kind of go into this current situation that we have seen, not just at the border, but over the last, I would say, 10 years in Haiti, and particularly the US's involvement and role in what's been happening in Haiti over the last 10 years, and then open this up for discussion, which I believe Bernard and Omavi will lead that component. But I'm really interested in hearing what you all thought about the readings, what you all are reflecting on about these issues. And we'll go from there. So as Omavi mentioned, I am one of the supervisors at the Global Justice Clinic, which is NYU's kind of human rights clinic. And I think, I did this clinic actually as a student. And one of the reasons I was excited to return about a year ago is because of the commitment I saw that the clinic actually really was passionate about following the lead of activists and organizations in directly impacted communities in Haiti. As Omavi mentioned, my family's from Haiti. My grandma is currently still in Haiti as we speak. And so I think that is critical for me, and hopefully is critical as you all continue to think about how these issues actually impact directly affected people. So just to give a few examples of some of the work we do, and I'm going to grab some water because it seems like I need it. Over the last 7 years, we've worked in partnerships with organizations like Collective Justice Mine en Haïti, which advocates against the practices of mining companies from the US and Canada in Haiti. And, recognizing our place as an institution based in the US, that impacts the types of issues that we take on and who we choose to try to seek to hold accountable. So we primarily focus on cases and advocacy that relates to the impact of governments, companies, or institutions based in the global north, hence mining companies in the US and Canada. And then since I've come on, since my background is in immigration and migrant rights, we've been doing a little more work at the intersection of migration and human rights, specifically pertaining to Haitian migrants. And some of the stuff we've been doing is engaging in advocacy related to supporting certain immigration policies like temporary protected status for Haitians, but also, fighting against deportations to Haiti, especially during COVID. And, as you've likely seen on the news, what's been happening in Haiti and with experiences of migrants in Texas, it's been quite an eventful year to be doing this work professionally, but also personally, as Omavi kind of referred to. So before we get into kind of all of the heavy stuff that has been happening most recently, I wanted to start this conversation about exclusion and displacement with an example of some of the opposites of those things, I think. One of the things that I really appreciated when Omavi was talking to me about this class was that one of the goals is the reimagining and re-envisioning of a world where freedom is expanded. And I think Haiti's example, even 200 years ago, as discussed in Ada Ferrer's piece, actually does provide us with this glimpse of another way. And so for me, as a former immigration lawyer, that piece was inspiring because although I'd grown up, in a Haitian family, I'd learned about, the unprecedented Haitian Revolution from a very, very young age. I didn't necessarily grasp how that push to liberate, how Haiti's push to liberate people outside of Haiti's borders after the revolution actually still remains revolutionary today, as I think about concepts of citizenship, nationality, and even asylum. So I want to talk a little bit more about that stuff. But since not everybody here has read the readings, I thought I'd give a little bit of a brief summary of the dispute that is kind of discussed. But I, again, would love to hear from you all more about what you thought about this reading later. So this dispute centers around 7 enslaved men from Jamaica who managed to escape to southern Haiti on a boat in 1817. And their slave owner goes to Haiti and tries to demand their return. So unfortunately for him, the president of the southern part of the country at that time, Alexandre Pétion, there had been a recent amendment or change to the Constitution. And so the Haitian Constitution of 1816 had a new article in it, Article 44, that said that any African, Indian, or descendant of Africans or Indians who came to Haiti would be recognized as Haitian once they set foot on soil. And secondly, every constitution from the revolution on in Haiti made very clear that slavery was abolished. So according to the laws of Haiti, as Pétion said repeatedly to many different people, this man no longer had any claim to his former slaves since they were now Haitian and couldn't be slaves by law in Haiti. And so I think there are a few, that's just a brief overview, but I think there are a few concepts that Ferrer mentions in her article that are important to note, just in order to see how revolutionary this was at that time. So, she talks about how the concepts of legal free soil and sanctuary that were in place and were in fact in place in other countries, those weren't necessarily new. But what was new is the fact that Haiti's version of those concepts were in fact more radical than any of the other precedents, because and I quote this because I think she has so many great quotes, but she says, free soil was declared in the geographical space where it most mattered, where people could actually reach freedom. This was in the middle of the Caribbean, where colonies full of slave masters and enslaved people were all around them. And freedom was an actual attainable thing for those who could get there. And I think that kind of connects to my next kind of broader point, which is that Haiti was actually implementing and living out these ideals that many other countries, quote, espoused at that time, but Haiti actually made them meaningful. Haiti actually made them real and concrete for people. Another quote that I liked, especially because I think Haiti and plenty of countries in the global South are often invisibilized in terms of their contributions to international law. But she says, Pétion Haitianized universal rights, which means, the human rights proclaimed and then denied to Black people the world over were respected and actualized in Haiti, particularly the right of liberty. And so she also compares that with that Haitian constitution with the 1789 Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen in France, where they say, men are born free and equal in rights. All the while slavery continued in France, and that abstraction that is used in that declaration, she juxtaposes to the Constitution, where it specifies explicitly the location where freedom would be made real. And so it's no longer an abstract proposition, but freedom from real existing slavery. And then the last right that I think, I'll say it again, but as an immigration lawyer, especially one whose 5 years of immigration practice fell in the same tenure as Trump's administration, the fact that Haiti pioneered certain aspects of the right to asylum. So in 1816, actually, Haiti was the first country to incorporate the right of asylum into its constitution. And Ferre highlights that, not only was this, not only was that exceptional, but the fact that Haiti recognized enslavement as a form of persecution that obligated the granting of asylum was transformative as well. And I'm going to segue there from not just this article, but kind of this broader scope of how Haiti has been impacted by this concept of freedom, but also utilizing the concept of freedom as an assertion of its sovereignty and its sovereign power, because as a sovereign state, it had the power and ability to offer asylum to fugitive slaves, but that sovereignty was perpetually challenged, right? That sovereignty was challenged when Napoleon attempted to reimpose slavery. It was challenged when the French demanded an independence debt in order to recognize Haiti. It's been challenged so many times, but not just in the 19th century. Haiti's battle for sovereignty continues to persist to this day. And so I want to talk about that and some of the ways in which the US specifically has been challenging and undermining Haitian sovereignty, but also how that connects to migration. Because, and I'm just curious, how many people have studied the US occupation in Haiti previously? I would love to just get a show of hands, your real hand or the fake little yellow hand, just to get a sense of how common that is. Okay, thanks so much. So yes, the US occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934, and then continued to control its finances for the subsequent 10 years. And those, again, that's kind of earlier on in history, but not too long ago. And then, but I think what's important is, there's just continual meddling and intervention, but that's often deeply intertwined with migration surges from Haiti. So those are not disconnected. The history of intervening in Haiti in detrimental ways has been paired also with the US repeatedly turning its back on refugees that have fled due to conditions that the US has contributed to. So just to give a few examples, you have the US support of the dictators François and Jean-Claude Duvalier, where, the US's support for them was ostensibly, due to Duvalier's kind of staunchly anti-communist stance, which was strategic. However, due to that, they continue to support him even as, disappearances, torture, all of these things evidence of these things continue to pile up over the years within the 60s and 70s and with his son in the 80s. And they continue to turn a blind eye to that. And so as people started to flee these brutal regimes, particularly in the 70s, the US, instead of recognizing the political persecution that people were in fact facing, they, as Bernard kind of alluded to, only viewed Haitians as, quote, economic refugees. And therefore, it continued to implement just increasingly draconian immigration policies. Our immigration detention system was actually, the modern one, was birthed through our response to the influx of Haitian migrants in the 70s and 80s, because the government, that was the first time the government instituted a mandatory detention policy with no possibility of bond. And so we have that in the 70s and the 80s, and then a similar thing occurs in the 90s, because you see a US involvement, and then you see also a spike in Haitians trying to flee those conditions. So in 1991, there was a coup in Haiti that overthrew Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was the first democratically elected president. And the people who orchestrated that coup were in fact leaders of what has been confirmed to be a CIA-backed organization in Haiti. Many of the people involved were trained by US forces. And then after that coup, at least 5,000 Haitians are killed by the military and these coup leaders in Haiti. And then as a result, people start fleeing, and many of you may have seen images or heard of the phrase, Haitian boat people. And that's where this has started, because tens of thousands of refugees embarked in these terrifyingly, incredibly questionably seaworthy boats to try to get to Florida, just because of how dire the situation was. But yet, even though they were involved, the US again ramps up its immigration enforcement policies to be even crueler and even harsher, because that's when our lovely interdiction policy developed. So Bush authorizes the Coast Guard to intercept boats of Haitian men, sending many back to Haiti to prevent them from reaching US soil. But then they also sent them to Guantanamo. Would love to know how many people knew that we sent Haitian refugees to Guantanamo in the 90s. At a certain point, feel free to put your hands, again, it's just helpful for me to know how common some of these things are, and really how little we often know about some of this history. At the peak, this camp held more than 12,000 Haitians. And so I provide these examples because I think, unfortunately, what we saw in Del Rio a few months ago, I guess now, with the accelerated deportation of Haitians, which is in fact one of the largest mass deportations that the US has ever implemented. This is actually just a continuation of a singling out of Haitians for particularly draconian immigration policies. And I think that, the racism and anti-Blackness of US policy towards Haitian immigrants, it's multifaceted, because you have this extraordinarily cruel immigration policy towards Haitians, but then you have the imperialist interventionist foreign policy towards Haiti that hasn't never stopped, since the US, I believe. So the Haitian Revolution was in 1804. The US did not recognize Haiti until 1862. And Frederick Douglass once said, Haiti is Black and we have never forgiven her for being so. And I think that plays out, in fact. So, I've talked a little bit about how the migration surges have followed US involvement in the past, but I think it's important because I think a lot of what's happened with and how in the world did 15,000 Haitian migrants get to the U.S.-Mexico border, a lot of the context is decontextualized, and we're not always familiar with what the U.S. has been doing in Haiti. And so I want to talk about what that's been like over the past 10 years, since that's the time range in which we've seen these new waves of migration from Haiti to South America and then up to the US-Mexico border kind of develop. So, sorry guys, sirens. In another one of your readings, Edwidge Dansicat writes about this quite succinctly, because she highlights, can everyone still hear me? Okay, thanks. She highlights that post-earthquake, 2010, 2011, in that election, there was documented pressure by the US, and you can find this in WikiLeaks, in fact, but to push the predecessor of the formerly assassinated president, his predecessor is named Michel Martelly, into power and into a runoff election, putting his party, which I will just go by the acronym for now, is PHTK, into power. And that was the same party in which this previous president, Jovenel Moïse, who was assassinated, was a part of. And the reason I'm focusing on that, there was the earthquake in 2010, and unfortunately, as well, the U.S. was heavily involved in the failed reconstruction efforts post-earthquake. But I'm going to leave that. I'm going to cabin that for another time. But this political party, PHTK, has just been. I stumble or hesitate to put into words how horrific they have and how much they've destabilized the country over the last 10 years. And so, they were increasingly defined by corruption, increasingly defined by human rights abuses. Even the US government, I think earlier this year, identified there was a 333% increase in human rights violations between 2018 and 2019. And yet, they continued to support this president. They continued to support Moïse even after so many constitutional and legal experts in Haiti stated that his mandate was actually supposed to be concluded in February 7th, 2021, according to the Constitution. He contested and said that it should be 2022, and the US and a number of other ambassadors from Canada, from France, stood behind him in that decision. But in the interim, he was in power, I believe, for 4 years, and he did not hold a single election, parliamentary, legislative. The parliament disbanded. There were, I believe, before his death, there were 10 elected officials in the entire country. And there was just a systematic destabilization of government institutions but yet everyone in Haiti will tell you that the only reason he remained in power was due to the US support, because Haitians were in the streets for years, tens of thousands of Haitians from 2017, 2018, 2019, in the streets protesting what they saw as just outrageous corruption. Unfortunately, there were multiple state-sanctioned massacres in 2018 and 2019, which, this isn't entirely new, but this kind of state-sanctioned, but state kind of influenced violence that gangs would kind of perpetuate in historically kind of disempowered but very politically active neighborhoods became kind of just I don't know how to explain it, but just a very well-oiled strategy, a well-oiled machine that continued to be put in place in 2018 and 2019. The US even sanctioned some government officials in the Moïse administration, but yet continued to support him and up until his assassination in earlier this year. And one of the things that, I think, again, I'm from the diaspora, I'm not Haitian, but I think it's important. I'm not Haitian as in I don't live in Haiti, but I think it's important to recognize that people did lament his death, but they lamented his death as the kind of culmination of a culture of impunity that he perpetuated and that the US stood aside and watched, if not supported. And so, you know, as we see in the news this information about kidnapped missionaries and increases in kidnappings, I think it's important to recognize that contextualization where gangs over the last 10 years have amassed so much power by being connected to the government in a way that is unique, that is not something, you know, that I grew up seeing when I was going to see my family or that my family tells me about. This is a quite unique phenomenon that has accelerated over the last 10 years. Unfortunately, there was this is a kind of a translation challenge, but in, I believe it was 2018 or 2019, gangs unionized, quote, or federated, and basically became an alliance that the government effectively supported. And that actually has contributed to the strengthening of the gang power to be approximately control over 60% of the territory, some people say now. So I think that, you know, sometimes people think this sounds like a radical or alternative analysis of US involvement in Haiti. So I do want to quote the former special envoy to Haiti, Ambassador Daniel Foote, who recently resigned out of protest, not due to the recent mass deportations, but also to the way that the US has handled policies in Haiti. And so some of the things he said were, and I'll just quote them, but he says, you know, what our Haitian friends really want and need is the opportunity to chart their own course without international puppeteering and favored candidates, but with genuine support for that course. I do not believe that Haiti can enjoy stability until her citizens have the dignity of truly choosing their own leaders fairly and acceptably. He talks about the current prime minister who the US continues to support. You know, last week, the US and embassies in Port-au-Prince issued another public statement of support for this unelected de facto prime minister, and have continued to tout his, quote, political agreement over another broader, earlier accord shepherded by civil society. And these are the two lines that I think are very important. The hubris that makes us believe we should pick the winner again is impressive. The cycle of international political interventions in Haiti has produced catastrophic results. And so I think going into this history and these examples of intervention is critical, as I said, because I think Haiti's issues are often so decontextualized. People talk about Haiti being the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere without discussing who was involved in making it that way. We lament the numbers of refugees and migrants leaving Haiti without discussing who's complicit in creating the conditions that have made it so difficult for people to live there safely. And so I know I've gone on for a little bit, so I will try to wrap it up. But when thinking about Haitian migrants today, you know, I can't stop thinking about the role that Haiti played in opening its borders to secure freedom for any enslaved person who could get there. And you know, Ferre mentions this as well, the critical role that Haiti played in supporting freedom movements and the liberation of those in South America, particularly with military and financial support of Simón Bolívar. And one of the reasons I can't stop thinking about that is just how much of a contrast that is to how Haitians have been treated throughout this entire hemisphere. So now, you know, due to the past 10 years, these migration movements, it used to be just that the US, Canada, and the Dominican Republic were the primary destination countries, but now we have over 100,000 Haitians in Brazil, in Chile, thousands in Mexico, thousands in Argentina. And you all also read, you know, that report called A Journey of Hope about kind of what that journey has looked like for people. And you read about how torturous that journey is, that, you know, it could take 2 to 3 months. People are traveling, trekking through the Amazon and the Darien Gap to get from Brazil and Chile back up to the US-Mexico border after already having done that journey once to get there in the first place in the past 10 years. In 2012, I interviewed Haitian migrants who were who had just arrived in Brazil with a human rights organization there, and the stories of the atrocities and the things that people experienced to get there, to know that they left those countries to do that journey again, shows just how dire their circumstances, even in those countries, for them were. And the reason I bring that up is because, this brings me back to the piece that Bernard referenced earlier, the podcast where we heard from Tendai, because she highlights just how transnational anti-Blackness is, right? So I think the example or the case study of Haitians in the Western Hemisphere has shown that, unfortunately, not only have they experienced harassment and horrible conditions at the US-Mexico border, but the reason that they ended up there is because of the discrimination that they experienced in Brazil, that they experienced in Chile, that they experienced even in Mexico when they arrived there. And I think that's important, because I think we need to think about the legacies of colonialism, colorism, slavery in all of those countries, and how anti-Blackness, as Tendai said, needs to be combated in a transnational way. I appreciate how she mentions the fact that white supremacists are very transnational, that they, borders don't stop them from sharing their ideas and their plans and their strategies. And she sees the need for, anti-racist movements and movements that are seeking to fight anti-Blackness to be transnational in that way. And so for me, that's one of the questions that interests me, is how do we develop movements? I think particularly as someone who's from the Haitian diaspora, who's been in Canada for 50, 60 plus years, we're seeing these new diasporas develop who've only been there for the past 10 years. And how do we build power and community power in these communities to fight the discrimination that they're facing, to fight the just to know their rights, to understand their rights, and to advocate for themselves. So I think that's a bit of a summary of what I wanted to share, but I am interested in, and I'm going to pass it on to Bernard and Omavi for questions, but I am interested in hearing, for those who have done the readings, in what ways did this example of Haiti help you reimagine or re-envision kind of the conceptualization of nationality or citizenship or freedom as it pertains to borders? And if there are any ideas on how to strengthen transnational movements to combat some of the things that we've seen and some of the ways that we've seen Haitians be treated. So I'm going to pass it on, but thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that powerful foray into the conversation. Yeah, we can give real applause. It's all good. It's not against the Patriot Act yet. I don't want to sort of disrupt that flow. That was a great transition into the conversation. So you asked two questions. So I'll ask you just to repeat those two questions, and then we'll just open it up for everybody to either give their reaction to the readings, or either any of the readings, or to answer those two questions that you posed. So please repeat those, if you will.
Sure. I guess the first one is just, are there ways in which the, Ada Ferrer's piece and this kind of highlight on the specific ways that Haiti addressed issues of nationality, citizenship, or freedom across borders, are there ways in which that is either, helps you reimagine or re-envision the ways that we handle those kinds of concepts now? And secondly, are there thoughts or recommendations or strategies that you've thought of as to ways to strengthen transnational movements kind of against anti-Blackness and against racism?
The floor is open for anybody to respond to those questions. All right, well, while people are thinking about their responses to those questions, I'll say that I know for sure that some of the students in the practicum have been thinking about sort of transnational ways of organizing, particularly in the global South. And I thought it was really instructive what you touched on about the collaboration between, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Pétion?
Pétion, yeah.
Pétion and Simone Bolivar, and other sort of South American patriots who sort of shook off colonialism in South America. And you know, it made me think about sort of the power of the framing of the struggle being done by people directly impacted by the harms that we're rallying against, right? And it makes me think about sort of our struggles here domestically in the US in a couple of ways. One, our struggles domestically in the US in terms of making sure internally people who are directly impacted by the issues we're concerned about have a defining seat at the table, or a definitive seat at the table, where they can help shape the conversation. Because, you know, as you know, we could see in those revolutionary constitutions of Haiti a fundamentally different conception of freedom than we had in sort of the revolutionary US context, and how that was sort of informed by sort of people being directly impacted, having a definitive seat at the table. I mean, it's actually their table, you know? And so it makes me think about that. And it also makes me think about, you know, is there any such thing as a refuge from the harms that we're rallying against if we're surrounded, right, by areas where people are still being devastated by these harms, right? So I thought about how, you know, revolutionary Haiti in the early years, you know, they're very sort of isolated in a way, and they I mean, they didn't have the capacity to sort of do what other revolutionary movements did in, say, Russia and France, and just go on these expeditions trying to spread out their theory of change, and how that might have, you know, contributed to the sort of ephemeral nature of some of the most radical aspects of their revolutionary project. And so those are some of the sort of my takeaways from the readings and from your conversation. I think that, yeah, and I guess the final thing is like this idea of borders, and how even Haiti sort of redefined the purpose of borders, and instead of being a means of exclusion exclusively, like using its border as a means of liberation and inclusion. And Tendaye talks about, on, if we go to page 10 of the reading packet, talks about third paragraph. The third paragraph, in sort of the middle of the paragraph. Actually, before I ask this, I think there's something like unique about her position, because she's UN adjacent. So it's not like she's trying to abolish the UN and she's going to rail against you know, the international order or whatnot, but she clearly has this very critical lens. And I think that is illustrated in part by sort of the second really long sentence of the third paragraph, where she talks about the siloing might be between people who understand themselves as lawyers and then people who understand themselves as movement actors. And as someone who's on the side of, who's most steeped on the side of lawyering, I think that there's a very big gap in a lot that lawyers have to learn from movements and from immigrants themselves about what true border justice might look like. And I guess one of the questions I have is, when we think about border justice, and we think about current conversations about possibly abolishing borders, and what borders means in 2021. Do we see border justice as a contradiction in terms, or is there some meaning we can give to border justice to make it consistent and consistent internally and consistent with sort of the abolitionist principles that we've covered in our meetings? So any response to that? Go ahead, Dalla.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Omavi and Bernard and the union for putting together this session. And Gabrielle, thank you for a really thought-provoking introduction. To respond to your question, Omavi, I think the question of borders can be viewed as liquid. Borders mean different things for different people. So the framing of the Haitian migrants today as economic migrants, and as Gabrielle mentioned in reference to the first piece of the reading, racialized and reviled economic migrants that are unwanted, similar migrants from different places, share different experiences, and the border itself becomes liquid, becomes a barrier to certain people in different ways. So it's really good. I think a good way of viewing that issue is one, the historical narrative and the powers that apply on different section of people. So using Haiti as an analytical lens that intersects race, power, colony, gives us an interesting way of viewing how these powers manifest. And then the idea of sovereignty and how sovereignty is actually deployed, but also excised. So you see sometimes the United States carves out legal, and other jurisdictions, of course, in international borders, they carve out legal black holes, just to say that we're not going to ascribe, because of the nation state model, we're not going to abide by our international obligations, even under positive or customary international law. So that being a function of how power brokers or people who can deal power rewrite the rules of the game every single time. So sovereignty becomes another liquid concept. Borders become another liquid concept. And it's interesting to see how these constructions manifest themselves in this regard. So I thought, that would be a good point of discussion, to see the intersection between power, sovereignty, as manifested in the Haitian example through history.
Great points, great points. And we're going to go to Nini, then Lily. But I think key in what you're talking about, Della, is in power, is also the power to recognize and the power to refuse, and how the Haitians themselves exercise that power to recognize and refuse which of the laws they sort of wanted to recognize and refuse. Go ahead, Nini.
Hi. So I think when I was reading the Adafara piece, I was thinking about thoughts I had about American imperialism and especially in the global South, and about this idea I read in this book about sovereignty itself being an economic asset, about how the lesser sovereignty a country enjoys, however liquid or not it might be, what it really impacts is not just the political economy, but also just economic progress of that country. And I was thinking of that in terms of how that affects countries like Haiti, which a lot of history that I only read from the piece, which is extremely enriching, but also about other colonized areas where you see it not just affecting the economy of the area, but also just how it affects things like how present insurgencies, or how your laws, or how police violence, it's all very impacted. And how sovereignty itself, when you were discussing racial borders or sovereignty being liquid, that in this time of where it's just neo-colonization, even though these are democracies which seem like democracies but really aren't, where your sovereignty is so liquid that everything is controlled. And yeah, so I think I was thinking about all of that and seemed just yeah, I think it was like a very troubling thought to think about how even civil societies, like I didn't know how to ask you this question, but I was just wondering how the civil society in Haiti is fighting back or trying to, within just these decades of all the trouble that they've had. And I was wondering if you could maybe give us some information on what they've been doing, how movement lawyering happens, and how if there's a movement to work outside of the law, and yeah, what kind of work is being done there. That'd be really great.
So Lily, please promise me you'll hold that thought, but it would be great to hear Gabrielle's response to that question.
Sure, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think that, yes, in all of the kind of dire circumstances, I think that the progress and the push and the kind of resistance may sometimes get lost. So I'm glad, thank you for that question. And that gives me space to share a little bit, because, you know, we've been working with these organizations and these activists for a long time, but they have been doing this for far longer, right? Like, these are people who've been doing this work, you know, 30, 40, 50 years. You know, I would say maybe about, I'd say like six to 8 months ago, people were actually very hopeful. And I'm not saying that they're not still, but I'll say that's the last time I had this particular conversation, maybe 3 to 4 months ago. But people were very hopeful because they saw that, actually, I'll go back to this. So even prior to the president's assassination, in March of this year, something called the Commission for a Haitian Solution to the Crisis was created. And this commission now has over 900 civil society organizations, unions, Protestant, Catholic, Voodoo organizations, like literally everyone in Haitian society is kind of represented in one way or another in this commission. And they started it in the midst of everyone ignoring them and saying that this president had another year, because they saw that this was a very it was a constitutional crisis. What was happening was directly counter to the Haitian Constitution in terms of this president maintaining its power. And so they organized themselves to create a commission and to create an accord to basically try to find a way out of this crisis. And over the last several months, they've been organizing and getting from like the creation of this thing to an actual accord that I think it's close to I think it's like 600 or so different organizations have signed on. And I say this, you know, I think in Foot's resignation letter, he mentions an accord that the prime minister, the de facto prime minister, has put in place, which was an attempt effectively to co-opt this process that the commission developed. But just to see, like, I haven't seen a process where so many people have come together, you know, and just done this completely, like no one's getting paid. No one is like, people are doing this because they see that they have to have their own solution. Like, they have to find their own way out. And that's the only way that it'll be sustainable. And they are continuing to do that, even in the midst of this really dire security crisis. And they're continuing to advocate for the rights to get to decide for themselves what should happen. And so that is deeply uplifting, even in light of and despite, you know, the powers that be kind of refusing to acknowledge it. But they have been, because they've kept at it, like some of these people and some of these states and even the UN have been forced a little bit to listen, because they are not stopping. They are continuing. Now the ambassador, the former ambassador, continues to speak out about the fact that even the UN refused to meet with this commission, even though they are the ones that have the most buy-in. And so that's just one example, but Haitians will resist, have resisted, and will continue. And that is, I think, where I get my hope as well.
I always love when we can insert some optimism into these conversations. Thank you for the question and the great response, Gabrielle. Go ahead, Lily.
Yeah, sure. Thank you again, Gabrielle. I really appreciate your words here. And also thank you for putting together these really incredible readings, this set of readings that we brought here. Unfortunately, I think that my what I have to say is a little bit closer to what Abdullah was talking about prior to Nini's speaking. But if we could bring it back to, I think, the question of borders that I was particularly thinking about in the context of our discussion today and the readings. I definitely resonated with what Abdullah was saying about borders as liquidity, and that was sort of what I was thinking about a little bit as I read the Ferrer piece. And sort of as we talked about like Article 44 and Pétion, I thought it was particularly interesting to think about how even like when borders become liquid or when people cross borders, one caveat of the permission to cross that border, especially in the context of the colonial state, as Ferrer presents it, is like assigning labels as the person crosses or even approaches the border. Like as you were mentioning, Gabrielle, the of being an immigrant, and in the colonial state and in the context of a place that is appealing for somebody to migrate to, those labels then are inflexible once they're assigned to you and determining of your rights and privileges in the space as an immigrant. And in the eyes of the state and in the eyes of the law, that label is determining. So what was particularly inspiring to me when we talked about Article 44 and that the case of the enslaved people who arrived on the boat in Haiti was that instead of assigning a negative label upon arriving in Haiti, people were able to achieve a positive label. And that was a new way of using that border liquidity to sort of assign privilege upon arrival instead of removing privilege, removing the law. And even playing with the concept of nationality and rejecting the stability of the categories of nationality and citizenship, but still acknowledging that those categories hold status and allow people to access spaces and rights on land and on sovereign places. I thought that that was sort of how I was understanding the different concepts of borders as we.
Thank you for that, Lily. Yeah, thank you for that. I have a lot of follow-up thoughts on that, but I'll shut up and turn it over to Chakshu. Seems like she has something on that score as well.
Yeah, I had some related thoughts about just thinking about borders as a framework. The first reading also mentioned, race itself as a border and how it serves to exclude and include, and building upon that, the second reading touched upon, white supremacy being transnational. And so like that's really kind of changed the way I think about borders themselves. It's a much broader way of thinking about it. And that was just, I think, something else to add to all of the nation state stuff going on. But yeah, that's all.
Yeah, before going to Sanjana, it's crazy. We have transnational white supremacy and then transracial and transnational liberation movements with South America and Haiti. Go ahead, Sanjana.
Yeah, no, I think related to what Abdullah and Lily were saying about borders, I think that maybe one thing that I also can't claim to speak very intelligently about this, but from my reading of trade law, I think one very obvious way in which colonialism plays out is the manner in which the US engages in the WTO. So where it serves US interests, which is the manufacture of goods, right? Where you can cheaply source raw materials from developing countries and then mass manufacture them in this sophisticated capitalist machinery, and then cheaply flood them in those markets and wipe out the local market. So, when it comes to GATT, US is all borders must be open. It's so regressive that countries shut borders in trade law. And but when it comes to trade in services or the movement of humans, there they create exceptions and they rationalize the different ways in which they think about this. I think most recently how this has played out really not even recently, there's a very long history of this, but about the US's response to TRIPS. And South Africa and India have been able to manufacture drugs cheaply for decades, and they've been pushing for like diluting trips or just to be able to deal with the AIDS crisis. And the US has consistently opposed that. And that plays out today in the vaccine apartheid. So I think I was also thinking about how when we speak about borders, that there's this clear hypocrisy in where the border applies. Like when it comes to the movement of humans, the border is strong. But when it serves capitalist interests, then the border must not exist at all. And we'll pressure like every country holding on to the border to let go of that. And that honestly is also very simplistically what the basis of colonialism is, right? Like at least in India, the British came because of that, was a way to cheaply procure cotton. And then it was a way to cheaply, to get rid of the handloom industry there and then to sell industrially manufactured cotton in India because the market was also there, right? So like the economic basis of the market as the origin of colonialism everywhere in Europe, and how the US operates today in trade law, I think has very interesting parallels. Yeah, I have a couple of unrelated thoughts, but I think I'll wait till the discussion moves to those. Yeah.
All right, we're gonna give Gabrielle a chance to respond to that, and then to Sanjana's point, Bernard's gonna switch us a little bit to pivot to discuss another area of interest related to these readings and these topics. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I didn't get into a ton of like the neoliberal economic policies that have also devastated Haiti, and that would take a long time as well. But I will mention, I think you're totally right on that. There's Haitians have, you'll see, the painting behind me, it's a very agricultural, this is a Haitian painting, but it's a very agriculturally based economy and society really. And Haitian rice, which is like my favorite thing in the world, but Haitian rice has been decimated, and Haitian rice farmers have been decimated due to the flooding of US cheaper rice imports into Haiti. And even Clinton has apologized for some of these things post his presidency because of how devastating they were, but yet continue to be, and so I that's just one example of there are so many, unfortunately, but I think you're very much right on that.
And we'll turn it over to Bernard. I'll just quickly note Clinton's from Arkansas, and the #1 export agriculturally from Arkansas is rice, and so it's horrible. Go ahead.
Those are not unrelated, yeah, for sure.
Exactly. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, this has been a really rich conversation, and particularly these points Sanjana was making about the differences between human persons going across borders and trade. And for anyone who is interested, there we had a terrific Abolition Democracy 1313 session on borders, on open borders and abolishing borders last year, with some really good readings and a good conversation. Harsha Walia takes the position, of course, that we need to abolish borders completely. Others were making the argument for open borders, but there's a real live debate right now on these questions of what is the difference between open borders versus abolishing borders completely. So I thought that was important and relevant and helpful. But I thought we could turn the conversation a little bit to kind of how is, the question here would be kind of how is the desire for economic betterment or security or non-precarity kind of portrayed and characterized and then used against certain persons and not others, right? Because the ideology of capitalism is about economic betterment, right? It's what's foundational to the ideology that produces these forms of crisis. And yet, of course, in certain contexts, and the Haitian person who is trying to migrate is the perfect case, the desire for economic betterment is characterized in a negative way. I'm thinking of this particularly because of the student strike and because of the way in which kind of the desire for some form of economic security and non-precarity becomes characterized or gets characterized as being kind of, I don't know, inappropriate in an intellectual setting, in a community of in a shared community such as ours, where we are supposed to be, thinking about ideas or something, as if there's not actually real work going on here that needs to be compensated. So how is the desire for some economic betterment and stability and security characterized? And what's interesting in the case of in the case that we have today in terms of Haitians is that economic desire for betterment is also twined in a way to the threateningness of Haiti. And we have that with the Haitian Revolution as having been so threatening to European nations, because it was an extraordinarily, it was, the first uprising, that revolution that came really from a different space than the kind of bourgeois revolutions of the late 18th century. And that's very threatening to European interests and American interests, not only the revolution, but then also the way in which kind of free soil notions were created, as Gabrielle was explaining. Now, but that history, I feel, in the context of Haitian persons who are migrating, is almost forgotten, I think. I mean, I don't think many people today know that history when they are characterizing migrants in a particular way. It feels as if it's much more the anti-Blackness that is transnational, and that we see in the context of African persons trying to migrate across the Mediterranean as well, right? And that those parallels and that there's something about anti-Blackness now. And of course, there's also a certain form of anti-Muslim or that goes on with the consideration of persons from Syria, for instance, or Iraq, or during the Syrian migration crisis. That could be a form of anti-Blackness or anti-Muslim, and the two are tied. But so the question becomes, in this particular context, do we think that the history is having a legacy on the way in which people are being characterized, workers are being characterized, persons who are seeking betterment are being characterized? Or do we think that what's really operating is predominantly a form of anti-Blackness? Because I'm just not sure that the historical legacy is something that people are still aware of, or does it operate in some other way, right? So does the legacy of colonialism operate in a different way as well? So those were some of the questions I thought we might want to broach, and maybe someone wants to pick up the thread here. But it is particularly relevant, I think, in our teach-in context because of the way in which something that is often that is often viewed as valorized, wanting to improve economically, gets characterized in these other contexts as being something so threatening and punishable and almost becoming worthy of death, right? The Mediterranean becoming a graveyard today. Did anyone want to pick up on some of those themes? Fonda, why don't you go ahead?
Sure, thanks. Just really quickly, especially in sort of the strike context, I'm just thinking a little bit about how you were saying, Bernard, about how this is supposed to be this community we're all thinking together and it's great and everyone is Columbia, yada yada. And I just remember this comment that one of my classmates once made, which was just like, Columbia is a hedge fund that occasionally engages in education, which is reductive. But there is this idea also that in talking about like producing intellectual work and all of the work that grad students are doing, it feeds into sort of the accumulation of capital and intellectual property like that Columbia owns. And once like, I feel like the property and capital interests of Columbia and their students start to diverge or conflict, that's when this kind of, oh, you shouldn't seek betterment in this way, you shouldn't have dental care, like that's kind of where it happens. And I wonder if it's like in a similar context, like when sort of the US government and the US ruling class like considers sort of the interests of the economic interests of the workers, of people who are enslaved and of people who are coming to this country to better themselves economically conflict with sort of the economic interests of people in power. That's sort of when this diverges, because I'm thinking about all of the people who cross the US-Mexico border every single year when it's like harvest season in California, and it's like totally fine. No one has any problem with it because, people who own these huge agricultural conglomerates are like making money off of it. That's totally fine. But if they came, to start their own farm and to do their own thing, then that's sort of when there is a tension. But I feel like that connects to sort of all of the other relations of power and problems that are operating here also.
Definitely, definitely. I think Gabrielle wants to respond to that as well. I'll just say this ties into what we've been talking about throughout the course in terms of like the narrative, right? And who controls the narrative and what fits within that. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
Yeah, just to touch on that point quickly, one of the things that I love about one of the things Tendai says is that Europeans were the quintessential economic migrants. And that kind of goes back to this question of whose narrative, right? Who gets to shape the story? Who gets to decide when venturing into other people's countries is acceptable? And even the how you Americans and Europeans get to be called expats when they go into the countries of the global South and take people's jobs as opposed to vice versa. But to go to your point, Bernard, about kind of the space in which the history does or does not take in terms of the current context, and I'm going to share this, even though it's probably one of the quotes that enrages me, but this is a quote that Biden said I think this is in the early 90s, but he said, if Haiti, a god-awful thing to say, if Haiti just quietly sunk into the Caribbean or rose up 300 feet, it wouldn't matter a whole lot in terms of our interest. And the reason I share that is because I think it is such a pure, just a decontextualization again. So you are able to, when it doesn't serve your interests, you're like, please, Haiti, go away. Like, I don't want to hear about it. However, you systematically chose to invisibilize it, right? And you, as in the US and other European countries, chose to invisibilize Haiti for your purposes and for your benefit, so that the concepts of freedom and liberty didn't, quote unquote, invade the people that you were enslaving in these other countries. And I just think that invisibilization of the history is very intentional. And I think it's important to remember, because what's also intentional is not making a big fuss or not making it very clear to everybody how involved the US has been in the destabilization of so many countries, Haiti just being one. So I think that context is critical. I think I'll stop there so other people can share.
Great. I see Maxwell's hand. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much to the organizers and the speakers. I'm here as a SWC member on strike, so I'm kind of coming in like a little out of the flow of the seminar, but just this point about the relationship between anti-Blackness and the threat of worker militancy just made me think of CLR James and this notion that the Haitian enslaved plantation workers were like the most modern proletariat, more modern than the European factory workers or Du Bois in the general strike in the US South, of course. But I also wanted to just thinking about the university right now, I would be really curious to hear, this is sort of maybe a slightly random point, but it just came up with Biden. I'm just curious about maybe any roles that Columbia affiliates may have played in US imperialism and its relationship to Haiti. I'm thinking maybe obviously of Barack Obama, but maybe there's others too that people know about and I don't. And then just very quickly, I just wanted to add one very quick invitation to seminar participants and any union members, which is that just putting Columbia on blast in a variety of ways and thinking more broadly about abolition, the relationship between the university and carcerality, is that the current city jails commissioner, Vincent Schiraldi, is currently co-director of the Justice Lab at Columbia. And I'm in touch with a community coalition mainly based in the South Bronx of community members who have been through the city jail system or have loved ones in it. One member of that coalition was on the call earlier and had to leave, but they just find it kind of shocking and appalling that this guy Schiraldi is presiding over a complete bloodbath in the city jails right now. 14 people have died this year, and yet he's still getting progressive reformist clout as co-director of the Justice Lab. He's on leave now, but so if anybody here is at all interested in connecting around that and making the obvious demand of Schiraldi, step down as Justice Lab director or step down as city jails commissioner, you can't do both. Would be happy to connect. So, but yeah, thank you everyone again.
And we've got some questions coming in also on the chat, which we should get to and maybe incorporate. We've got plenty of time, so I don't know if anyone wants to follow up on some of that, but I know Sanjana wanted to ask, or the direction you wanted to go in, Sanjana, was to hear about the union and the ICE and NYPD related issues. And then there's another question having to do with how we see the interconnected struggle of colonial settlerism of the institution itself, Columbia University, displacing Black and brown working class communities in Harlem. Now, obviously, Gabrielle, those aren't questions for you necessarily, right? In the sense that some of these, I think, are actually kind of threads and conversations for us as a group. Although, your work and the materials you've shared with us are so relevant to these questions, it'd be great to also have you in that conversation. Does anyone want to pick up on any thread that we've had so far? Gabrielle, anything that you want to add here? All right, well, great. Well, how about I see Gabriel first and then Sanjana?
I'll just very quickly respond to the question about the union demands regarding NYPD and ICE and CBP. So I kind of got unactive for a bit over the summer, but last spring, I don't know that we actually had those demands in what we were asking for in a contract, but now we do. The current ask is that, and it's actually included with our demands regarding health benefits. which I think is appropriate, is preventing NYPD and other government agencies like ICE and CBP from entering our campus or being given student records without due legal process. I'm not sure to what extent that's also like inspired by NYU, but NYU had a very firm demand that NYPD be kicked off campuses alongside ICE. And me personally and a lot of colleagues, like one of the reasons why we chose to vote against tentative contract, amongst many other things, was to support NYU in their strike, because I think they had very bold demands, and that was a super important demand. So I know that amongst like my comrades, at least in the union, this is a very, very important issue. I'm also like from the borderlands, and I think anywhere that CBP is or ICE is a place they should be kicked out of as soon as possible.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Sanjana, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's related a bit to the point that Fonda was making about intellectual property, but it's also fundamentally related to one of the questions that Gabrielle posed about how do we think about global South solidarities between social justice movements in the global North and in the global South. And I think one fundamental issue, which I think is just an existential crisis that I have because now I'm here in this institution, but the problem fundamentally is that we have these conversations at Columbia, right? Like the problem is that the conversation is monopolized in the US and the UK. And honestly, this wasn't something I thought very deeply about earlier, but I got whatever. I mean, there was this scholarship program at Oxford and everyone was fully funded. And I met these activists from like around the world. And at that point of time, someone was saying that they would have been more thankful if someone funded this in a country that was more visa accessible to us, for instance. Or like the US like dollar to rupee ratio is 75:1. It's ridiculously expensive to be here. So that really dictates who gets to be here from those countries. But I think I'm really interested in rethinking where these conversations happen and whether we can fundamentally dismantle that when we have these conversations in American institutions. And I mean, secondly, I think it's also about like, I mean, these are issues that the global South also has. So for instance, I mean, I think this is something that's entirely absent in like US, like case law, for instance, but like in India or like in global South countries, you'd see that they keep citing each other. But even to a certain extent, like the reason we cite that way, like the, you know, the Haiti example was really inspiring. But the reason we cite it is as even South Africa has this standard and therefore the standard is achievable to a developing country. Or even Hong Kong said that you shouldn't surveil protesters. So, you know, it's used in that context when we use it in Indian courts. But I feel like, yeah, I mean, I would be interested in your thoughts on reimagining like global South countries as leaders of human rights movements versus people that we, you know, assist while sitting in New York. Yeah.
Yeah, Omavi, I was going to give you space if you wanted to keep going or if you wanted me to respond to part of that, but.
Well, if you have a response, please.
Well, I mean, I appreciate something that I think just continually enraged me during Ada's piece, and it's not about her, but I think there were multiple times in which she, in additional footnotes, said, you know, in these conversations, nobody has talked about how Haiti impacted this. Like people just ignored or glossed over. And it was like time and time again, literally when it's things that you would think, you know, whether it's revolution or whatnot, you would think that Haiti would be in the picture. And so I very much agree with that. This invisibilization of others. I think just in terms of where this relates to kind of my work, one of the things, even with kind of migration work here in the US that I've found, even in this response to the latest influx of Haitian immigrants, has been that there's been so much activity, which I'm grateful for, and advocacy here in the US, but there has not been a connection with organizations in Haiti. Like these organizations have not, like, you know, there are language barriers and whatnot, but but there are a number of organizations in Haiti who have been working on the issue of Haitian migrants for quite some time and can speak to, what are the conditions in Haiti and whatnot, where the collaboration would strengthen the advocacy and would strengthen the fight, I think. But that, because it's just not as easy, or whatnot, or people don't think about it, it doesn't happen as much. And so that's part of what we're hoping to do is maybe strengthen those bonds and strengthen those connections, so that voice can be heard. But, I was on a call and they were like, no, we actually have no idea what's happening. Like, what are people doing in the US? Like, nobody was like, maybe we should circle back and let them know, because as a number of people pointed out, the people who are most enraged about what's happening are the people who have, see their brothers and sisters either on the border or were there themselves,
I'd like to pick up on that, but first we'll go to Camille.
Oh yeah, sort of along those lines, I have sort of been grappling with the idea of, will there ever be a way for the community suffering from oppression to liberate themselves without having to appeal to the institutions that are actually actively oppressing them? And this sort of, I guess, relates to the strike too, because at the end of the day, I don't want to be overly negative or anything, but it's still sort of unsettling how it feels still like a means of control for the oppressors, that they are the ones who get to decide whether or not the workers get these rights. And this sort of reminds me of a conversation that our class had about emancipation a few weeks ago, how actually sometimes emancipation just means that there's an added precarity in that your status as a free person is just dependent on the government and what they say, and them giving you this freedom as a privilege. So I was just wondering if that's something that could even be imagined.
I think that I want to pick up on that point. So first, I'd like to go to page 10 of the readings. First paragraph, where Tendaye says in the next to last sentence, I feel we are instead experiencing a co-optation of radical claims that will then be assimilated to sustain structures that will continue on and on, right? And this co-optation of radical claims, I think, cuts across a lot of the things we've touched on, or events we've touched on in this course, because there's an argument to be made. Camille mentioned emancipation. There's an argument to be made that during Reconstruction, the radical Republicans co-opted the radical claim of freedom of the enslaved Black folks. And then at the end of that process, we have this sort of perverted form of freedom where, sort of dominion is still imposed on these bodies. Freedom doesn't come with, property, right? You're free to become a landless peasantry in a sea of white supremacy, right? And so, but that is all sort of like morally justified through this co-optation of this radical claim of freedom. And here, even in these readings with Haiti, we see, I guess we see two things, right? First, that I guess we see Haitians try to insulate themselves from that co-optation, right? And so on 29, we see the first incomplete paragraph, first complete sentence. Ferris says, it bears saying that this version of universal rights in Haiti did not apply to most whites, as Article 38, 39 of the 1816 Constitution, echoing earlier ones, prohibited the entry of white men as property owners and denied them the possibility of becoming Haitian citizens, measures that were designed to impede the return of white French immigrants, sorry if I mispronounced that, with potential designs of re-enslavement and reconquest, right? So we see this sort of racial exclusion used to try to insulate themselves from, co-opting this revolutionary republic to sort of lead to re-enslavement, such as what happened in France itself, right? They declared, declared abolition, and then Napoleon came, co-opted, that revolutionary fur and, pushed from enslavement. But we also see the results of that on page 42 of the packet, the first complete sentence, and that result tying into this theme of the narrative that we discussed, being that Haiti's important interventions after 1804 appear to have been projected into something of a conceptual vacuum as far as dominant anti-slavery or rights thought was concerned. And that's in part because, I would argue the exclusion of, the powerful whites, right? It ties into the student union, because if, the tie with Columbia were severed completely, a lot of the grad students would not have the platform that they get by virtue of being affiliated with Columbia. It ties into what Sanjito was talking about, because I think part of the reason these conversations are had at these universities, and I'm speaking from my own experience being from Arkansas, which is a place with little to no geographical privilege in the United States, is that there aren't resources in a lot of places domestically, in the United States, and definitely internationally, where that will allow for us to have these robust conversations with the resources that we have at Columbia to have them, and the access that we have. And so I think that, us being at these places doesn't eviscerate sort of the shared experiences we have with oppressed people. I think we end up at these places because of, I think in a way, we're displaced ourselves, right? From these places, and a lot of people from our backgrounds are excluded from these places, and we just kind of make our way in. And in part, we come to these places to avoid that conceptual vacuum. And so it's like, how do we sort of exercise agency and autonomy like the Haitian revolutionaries did? And even then, they still appealed to British common law in the case that Gabrielle highlighted. But how do we exercise that autonomy and agency and avoid sort of falling into this conceptual vacuum, which might lead to us looking insularly, in which case it's not a conceptual vacuum at all, or just transnationally, transracially, and creating a new conceptual reality or framework that has to be robust and sustained in order to sort of have any impact or lasting power. So I'm hoping something I said was very problematic and somebody wants to tear it apart. All right, if anybody has any thoughts, please speak up. Do people think that, speaking of exclusion, like there needs to be exclusive like spaces for the like, do we have to exclude people who have sort of access to, you know, privileges that work to the detriment of marginalized populations? And how do we do that in our struggles and still sort of have lasting power? Does that make sense? Or is that strike two? Should I just be quiet now? All right, I'll take a strike two. This is a very humbling.
No, 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 no. You're posing such complex and deep questions. I think silence is more kind of our own self-reflective puzzlement over these questions. I mean, part of your question has to do in a way with separatism, I think, because exclusion might present problems in its kind of positive sense, but surely there are forms of separatism that are in a negative sense and achieve exclusion in a way. When W.E.B. Du Bois proposes in A Negro Nation Within a Nation in 1935 that there be separatism, a separate African-American cooperative society separate from white commerce, right? That's not so much exclusion as separatism, but it functions in the same way. And I think there are clearly valid arguments for separatism. And maybe important arguments for that being, in some contexts, the only way to think about moving forward.
Did it work to, like, with the benefit of hindsight? I guess part of the question, I mean, knowing what we know today about Haiti's reality, I mean, is it even a worthwhile exercise to think about what could have been done differently to sort of prevent it from being so isolated? Like, was that inevitable? And this ties into what Tendaye was talking about sort of the liberated Haitian body being just so vulgar, or Black sovereignty and Black self-determination being antithetical to the liberal project. And I mean, I'm hoping that there's a way in which we don't fall into an Afro-pessimist trap and, you know, think about how, given the sea of white supremacist, heteronormative, imperialist capitalism that we're in, you know, is there a such thing as a liberated zone if you're surrounded by areas of repression? Or is it the case that, you know, if you establish a liberated zone, it's incumbent upon you to do everything you can to make sure that the free land sort of knows no borders?
And so, Gabrielle, I think maybe you might have some thoughts on this. Just to tie it back in, because I'm always thinking about the strike. These issues of exclusion, I think, come in the context of kind of closed or open shops also, right? In other words, is a workspace open to kind of only unionized workers, or does it also include non-unionized workers, and how do we think about that? So there's a parallel here to the questions that you're raising, Omavi, in the strike and unionization context as well, although we don't need to address it, but at least it's important to see the parallel, I think. Gabrielle, we are getting close to closing time. So and we definitely want to hear from you as in a kind of wrapping up way on some of these threads that, not all of them are going to be tied perfectly, but if anybody else wants to jump in before we give kind of the platform to Gabrielle again. All right.
All right. Well, I'm glad I don't have to wrap up every single thread, but I think that I do very much appreciate these questions and hope that this will continue to be, I think via the practicum, it will definitely continue to be conversations that you all have. Just in response, I think to one of the things you mentioned, Omavi, like, could this have happened differently, or I guess I just think it's important to kind of reiterate the fact that, like, it's still happening, like I so wish that this was only, looking back at prior history of US intervention and being like, okay, what should we have done back then? When the reality is, this continues to be the struggle that we're fighting against. But I do think that it is helpful to, Haitian history is such a deep pool of a subject, obviously, as every country, but maybe just sharing a few resources I'd recommend to kind of dig deeper. There's a book called The Haitians, very clever title, but A Decolonial History by Jean Casimir. And it really goes into, for those of you, interested in labor movements, it really goes into kind of the counter plantation movements that Haitian paysans or farmers engaged in to just fight the kind of reinstitution of large-scale agriculture and large-scale plantations every step of the way, and continue to have that fight. But that I highly recommend. There's another book called The Aftershocks of History by Laurent Dubois that just goes further into, I think it's instructive in looking at just the impossible choices that Haiti was left with at various stages, whether it is accepting this absurd $21 billion debt payment that France said that Haiti had to pay in order for them to recognize their independence, but yet with literal cannons waiting to see if they didn't, ready to invade, is just one of the many examples of these choices. But I think that's important, and I think we have to keep looking back at our history, and to I believe Nini's point that people are continually fighting, and I think just going there for the inspiration and encouragement to keep going, because in the face of the fact that these were enslaved people from everywhere in the continent of Africa who managed to, mobilize and gain a common language and fight the Napoleonic army and win. I have to remember that history as I look at the current state of affairs, and I look to what can be done moving forward. But I think I'll leave you with that. Oh, and last thing actually is, if you want a longer teach-in or a follow-up next week, actually I think it's the week after, Monday the 22nd, from 4 to 5:30, we're doing a teach-in on Haitian migration at NYU, where I will be there, but also a journalist who's brilliant from Ayibo Post, and an activist who has been extraordinary, a young woman, Emmanuela Duyon, who has been in the fight, and you'll actually hear from each of them who've lived in Haiti for most of their lives. So that I'm happy to drop the link or share it with, I think I'll drop the link here if I have a chance. Yeah,
please do.
Yeah. So thank you again for having me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you again, Gabrielle, for joining us. clapping inaudibly and so forth. But yeah, we appreciate you. It's been very illuminating and very enriching, and we'll continue to take these lessons with us as we move closer and closer towards reimagining a just society, or imagining a just society towards the end of this course. And so I'll also thank Gabrielle as well for giving us this forum and opportunity to do this work and dive into these topics with integrity, given the fraught times at the university. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Gabriel, who will give us some announcements, and then Bernard will close us out, although he might have some burning thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you on behalf of the union to Bernard, Omavi, Fonda, Gabrielle. Gabrielle, amazing presentation. I learned so much today, honestly. I want to message you more about stuff maybe with the US-Mexico border and solidarity efforts we can try to build there. So before we all go, I just wanted to put out an announcement that we do this every day. We do digital picketing from 10 a.m. to noon Eastern time, and then from 4:30 until 6. And usually it doesn't look like this. It's actually more of like a concentrated organizing hour where you'll do phone blasts, you'll reach out to other events and try to get them to also be in solidarity and move their events off campus. So it's a very, very useful time to come in and try to do some direct organizing with the union. And again, I'm putting one more time the link to our hardship fund. Again, they are not going to be paying me my stipend or any other graduate workers or stipend imminently. So we do need a lot of funds in the hardship fund to keep fighting our fight. Thank you all again. Bernard, you can close us out.
All right. Okay. Well, big shout out to Gabrielle Apollon for joining us. Thank you so much, and for really leading this discussion, putting together the materials. Omavi, thank you so much for being the extraordinary teach-in moderator and for really bringing us through these materials. Thanks so much to all of the terrific graduate student workers who are on strike, and especially to Gabriel and Ava and Gloria, and there are many others behind the scenes who made this possible. And thanks to Fonda for all the work in helping coordinate all of this. So it's been a real wonderful event. Tomorrow, we actually have another event with the union. This one's going to be live down at the People's Forum, and so we've organized this. The folks down at the folks at the student union have done an extraordinary job of making this possible, of actually moving everything down there. And we'll be live with the People's Forum tomorrow night with Kianga Yamata Taylor, who's coming in from Princeton, and we'll be talking about the Combahee River Collective statement, and which really ties in well to issues of labor and strikes, but also to important issues of identity politics and organizing. So hope you will join us in the flesh tomorrow, actually down on 37th Street at the People's Forum. It seems like it's a great place. So it'll be a lot of fun with everybody from the union. All right, thanks, and see you soon, and good luck.
Thank you, bye-bye.